was rare. There was not many visions. And in the third verse, the lamp of God had not yet gone out. It paints a very dark picture, doesn't it, of the time of Samuel. It seems as though the time of judges had come to an end, and God needed to raise up a leader who was going to bring the people together. And he chose this young boy, Samuel. But of course, he wasn't ready at that time, and so he needed Eli to help him along. I think God calls Samuel in a very gentle but persistent way. I don't know how God spoke to you in the past, but sometimes when we want God to tell us something, we want it loud and clear, don't we? We want it painting in the sky. But for this young boy, anything like that would have perhaps scared him. And so he needed Eli's gentle voice speaking to him. And so when God called him the first time, of course, Samuel was used to Eli calling him, so he went to Eli, and Eli hadn't called him. And so Eli tells him to go back. And this happens another twice. Samuel is convinced that he's heard Eli's voice calling him. And in the end, Eli says, go back and listen. And if God speaks to you, say, speak, I'm listening. God is persistent, isn't he? If God wants us to do a job, then we can say no, and that could be it. But if he knows that there is that willingness, if we are available, we make ourselves available, he's going to be persistent, and he's going to keep on calling. And also, we need to listen carefully. Because when God did speak to Samuel, it wasn't a very good message, was it? And I don't know whether Samuel had to get all the facts right, but he had to listen intently to God. You see, God was using this young boy to test him, because if he was willing to do something like this, to be obedient in this awful situation, then God knew that he would be the man to turn Israel around from them turning away from God. I can remember when I just left school, I got a job in a cutlery manufacturer's, and they were three brothers who organised this firm. And they weren't very nice bosses. The one particularly that I dealt with was quick-tempered, bad-tempered. If you did anything wrong, it was always your fault. There was one particular Friday night where I had to take a parcel to the post office, and of course I had to send it special delivery. And normally when I went to the post office, I'd gather all the letters together about 5 o'clock and then have a gentle walk over to the post office. Or if I was late, then it would be about 5:15. And this parcel needed a letter attached to it. And for whatever reason, this director, he wasn't happy with the letter. And so at 5:10, he told the typist to type it again. And so she typed it, and by the time he got it and signed it, it was 5:20. Post office closed at 5:30. I had to gather all the post together, got to the post office, and it was too late. It was closed. And I'd put the letters through the letterbox, but I couldn't do anything with the parcel because it had to go special delivery. So all weekend, I was anxious about Monday morning. So Monday morning came, and I took the parcel to the post office, got it sent off. But of course, then I had to sit at my desk, excuse me, and I just had to wait for him to ring through to say what's happened about the parcel. And of course, he rang through. I went in his office, and he berated me for 5 minutes, telling me it was my fault, and this person at the other end, she'd not got the parcel, and I felt awful. And you can imagine Samuel being in that position. He'd had this message late at night. You wouldn't imagine that he got to sleep, would he? Because he'd be anxious. He'd have this awful message to tell Eli. And yet he was brave enough. When Eli called him the next morning, he went, and Eli encouraged him, didn't he? He said, "You've got to tell me everything." And I think that's the other thing in our walk with God. We need other people, don't we, to help us along the way. We can't do it on our own. So when God calls us, he'll often send us someone else to help us along the way, to guide us. And Samuel said this message. And I'm sure he didn't say it in condemnation of Eli, because he wouldn't really know the situation. But if we have a message like that, then we've got to speak in love, haven't we? If we've been called by God, we've got to express ourselves in love. And so I'll hand over to Cathy now.
Good morning, everyone. I can relate to quite a few occasions when God's shown me or told me how to respond to his calling. And I've just got a couple of little stories to tell you this morning. There was one occasion, and it was many years ago, and I was morning door steward at my local church in Calverton. And I remember a lovely member of our congregation, her name was Janet. And she walked into the door that morning, and she looked so sad. And she immediately broke down into tears, and she was inconsolable. So I just put everything down, and I took her aside, and I took her into the vestry, and I said, "Janet, is there anything I can do to help you? You don't have to tell me if you don't want to." Anyway, she broke down, and she said to me, "Well, we've just had some terrible news from our landlord. We've been renting a cottage out in the countryside for the last 12 years. And he came round last night, and he said to us, 'We need the cottage back, we need it urgently, and we'd like you to vacate it, preferably by the end of the month.'" Well, of course, Janet and her husband were distraught because they'd lived there for 12 years. And she said to me, we've been such good tenants. We've paid our rent on time. We've kept the property in pristine condition. We've always done the garden. But the landlord would not take a step back. He was adamant that we vacated by the end of the month. "I just don't know what we're going to do," she said, "because we're just stressed out." And again, my husband's not well. My husband, Harry, is not well, and he's just taking it so badly. So I just calmed her down, and I said, "Let's have a prayer," and we had a prayer. And suddenly, I felt quite lightheaded. I felt quite shaky. And I just blurted out, "Please don't worry. Please don't worry, Janet. I'll be able to find you a nice little house. And I'm sure it'll be available by the end of the month." So she looked at me and felt, "Well, I know you, Cathy, I know you well, and I know I can trust you, but this is just such a big thing to say." So I just said to her, look, just leave it with me. Let's go into the service, let's sit down, and I'll ring you later this afternoon. Well, of course, I sat in the service, couldn't really take much notice of what the preacher was saying that morning. I just felt, I said those words, but it wasn't me speaking. It certainly wasn't me speaking. I'd said those words. So as we prayed through the service, I felt God coming closer to me. And I just couldn't believe what he said. But the words were, Cathy, you need to ring your auntie. When you get home, you need to ring your auntie. Well, I just couldn't work that out because, why would God ask me to go home and ring my auntie? Anyway, I just prayed for Janet. I just said to God, have I been impulsive? Have I given her false hope? And, Lord, this is personal and sensitive, and it seems to be on my shoulder. What can I do? I'll just ask you just to guide me. So anyway, I couldn't wait to get home. I couldn't wait to be in the house and pick the phone up. Walked in the house, said hello to the children, and just went to the phone. And I rang my aunt, and she said, oh, hello, Cathy. She said, this is a bit of a surprise. She says, I was going to ring you later. And I said, oh, really? She said, yes. She said, I knew you'd be in at this time, so I was going to give you a ring. She said, I've been thinking about Gran's house. It's been quite a time since she passed away, and I've made a decision to put it up for rent. Well, what do you think? What do you think? She said, what do you think, Cathy? And I said, I think that's a wonderful idea, Aunt. I think that's an amazing idea. She says, but hang on a minute. The only proviso is that it goes to someone who we know, who we can trust, and who'll take it on for a long-term tenancy. Well, I'm sure you can put the end to this fantastic message from God. Yes, Janet and Harry moved into my Gran's house, and they lived happily there for many, many years. Sadly, Janet passed away a while ago, but her husband, Harry, still lives there today. Praise God. And now I'm going to share something with you that happened more recently. Perhaps some of you know Newark and you know Balderton. Peter and I didn't know much about Newark or about Balderton when we were asked to move there into the Newark circuit in 2017. So when we went to join the Newark circuit, we were given a manse in Balderton, and that's where we were able to live. As we established into ministry, we were sort of being part of the churches, but as we established within the community, we felt that there was a real need to provide a cafe where people could meet, have a chat in a warm environment, and we could provide light snacks and drinks at reasonable prices. Well, we looked at all the vacant butcher's shops that had closed down over the years and hairdressers' shops, and we just looked and looked, and we just couldn't find anything that was appropriate. But we'd still got this vision that we wanted to open some sort of cafe in Balderton Village. Anyway, time went on, and 6 months later, the property steward came to the church council meeting, and he'd got some bad news. At Balderton Methodist Church, we had a building at the back, a very, very, very old building with an asbestos roof. It was pretty ropey, and it wasn't actually part of the church. But it was rented out to one of the local schools, and it was used as a preschool. So they sort of just had the keys, and they used the building. And they'd been there, I think, for about 15 years, I think for quite some time. But the school had actually built an extension, and they were going to house the preschool. And that was wonderful for the children and for the teachers, because they were going to get a better building, they were going to be close to the school. But for us as a church, we were losing an annual income. And that meant an awful lot to us because, as you know, with old buildings, they do need maintenance. Sometimes heating breaks down and these things happen. So it wasn't really a good time for them to tell us that they were moving. But anyway, that's what we got to do and that's what we got to put up with, so there we were. So anyway, a few weeks later, after Easter in 2018, Peter and I went to our annual conference in Scarborough, and it was called ECG, run by a team from Methodist churches nationally. We loved these conferences. They were a time of refreshing and renewal, leaving behind the mundane tasks in the week and joining with friends for a great time of prayer, learning, teaching and fellowship. As we set off on the Tuesday morning, we travelled along towards Scarborough, and we got chatting about the situation with the building and the need and the cost of repair. And if we were to repair it, what could we use it for? Suddenly, I get a little bit excited, I'm afraid. I had a feeling that God was speaking, and I felt that experience similar to the one I had when I spoke to Janet all those years ago. And I said to Peter, well, do you know what? We need to have this building totally refurbished. And that can be the community cafe in Boulderton. It's near the village, it's behind the church, but we can make it a community cafe and also do something with the church as well, because the church it still is very, very involved with outreach for the community. Well, I think Peter thought, well, yeah, it's all right, Cathy, but I think this is a lot bigger than we envisaged. You know, let's think about the cost. But I just felt butterflies in my stomach, and I honestly could see the possibilities, and I just went on and on. He knows what I'm like. So as we travelled towards Scarborough, we continued to discuss the pros and cons, and in particular, how we would ever convince the congregation to consider this wild idea. I was getting really carried away. And I said to Peter, do you know what? I know what we'd call the cafe if we were able to do it. Let's call it Wesley's. That would be ideal since we're a Wesley Methodist church. Well, the next bit is just unbelievable. As we queued at the traffic lights, we were actually going into Scarborough, and it was very, very busy that day because there was a conference going on. We just queued at the traffic lights, and as Peter was moving forward with the car, this little Renault Clio pulls in front of us, slams his brakes on, and we were like, whoa, would you know what his number plate was? And I brought it with me to show you later. It was Wesley. It was Wesley. And that just made us feel, wow. It's just confirmed. It's just confirmed. This is definitely a positive way forward. So a few weeks after our return, once we'd made a few general inquiries and drew up some basic drawings, we called an impromptu meeting with the church, inviting everyone, not just the elders and members, but representatives from the community who were involved in outreach work. We put the suggestion forward, and obviously we were met with a lot of negative feedback due to lack of funds and an ageing congregation. So it wasn't easy speaking to some people, but then there were others who were enthusiastic, in particular looking ahead with the opportunity to expand on the work that the church was already providing for the community. So we agreed that, subject to applying for grants and of course our own fundraising, we would begin to work together, and that's just what we did. It brought us all so much closer together. And we got our sleeves rolled up sometimes. We met more regularly for prayer, and we continued to seek God's will. We had many, many ups and downs along the way, and it took 4 years to raise approximately £400,000. But we were amazed how God provided. God provided every last penny, even when we were turned down on lots of grant applications. He found others who were very generous. The Methodist Church were more than generous with the grants applied for, and our congregation and community were generous givers. Even though we were often put out and we endured times when there was no heat regularly. Through the winter it was pretty bad. There were holes in the roof, sometimes the toilets didn't work, sometimes we even had to close on a Sunday because the building just looked like a bomb site. But we just weren't phased. We wanted to carry on. So as we looked forward to what God had planned, we knew that eventually we would have the beautiful building which we have today. And in this building, we're open 7 days a week, more or less. We serve the community. We provide film clubs and children's clubs, play groups. We have a cafe 2 days a week. We have a charity shop. We have a warm space, plenty of coffee mornings, and there's a lot going off in the Wesley Centre. So when we were thinking about this project at the very, very beginning, I messaged a Christian friend of mine, and she came back with this saying, and this saying has kept us going all the way through. Where there is vision, God gives provision. So I hope you've enjoyed this little journey of faith with us, and we certainly enjoy speaking to others about it. So we all know our God is a great big God. Amen.